This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hey, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello to you also, Ralph.
Hello, at a time when the Biden regime is supporting the destruction of the ancient land of Lebanon, whom he's called in prior years an ally. He's letting Netanyahu destroy Lebanon with the same tactics that Netanyahu applied to the genocide in Gaza.
That's right, Ralph. And for more on that, go to Ralph's open letter about that at nader.org. As for this program, well, folks, it's that time of year again, open enrollment for Medicare, which means we are being inundated with television commercials and mailers offering us something called Medicare Advantage.
At Humana, we believe your health care should evolve with you, and part of that evolution means choosing the right Medicare plan for you.
Sounds good, doesn't it? Advantage. Well, not so fast. We here on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour know a thing or two about Medicare Advantage. We even call it by its true name, Medicare Disadvantage. Our first guest today, Dr. Adam Gaffney, makes no bones about calling Medicare Advantage, the privatized Medicare plans run by insurance firms but funded by the federal government, he calls them a ripoff. Dr. Gaffney is a member of the Cambridge Health Justice Lab, and his research focuses on healthcare financing, reform, and equity. And he tells us, quote, the core business model of Medicare Advantage relies on denying care to enrollees. If you want to resist Medicare Advantage's deceptive advertising, you won't want to miss our interview with Dr. Gaffney. Next up, we speak with another doctor. Dr. Marty Makary is a Johns Hopkins professor and member of the National Academy of Medicine. He is the author of 2 New York Times bestselling books, Unaccountable and The Price We Pay. And in his latest book, Blind Spots, When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health, Dr. Makary breaks open the medical dogma that he believes leads to public harm. We'll talk to him about the flawed consensus around treating peanut allergies, opioid addiction, hormone replacement therapy, heart disease, and other medical issues that he argues has made multiple health crises worse, not better. Finally, on the program today, we'll welcome author and Democratic activist David Brock, who has written a book entitled Stench, The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America. Mr. Brock started his career as a GOP operative, but then had a change of heart, which he detailed in his memoir, Blinded by the Right, The Conscience of an Ex-Conservative, in which he, quote, came clean and repudiated his years as a tool of radical right-wing interest, end quote. During Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings and their aftermath, Mr. Brock helped amplify the smear campaign that discredited Anita Hill, at least temporarily, and got Justice Thomas onto the Supreme Court. He regrets that now, and he spent the rest of his career trying to correct that mistake. In Stench, Brock argues that today's Supreme Court, with its ethics scandals and dubious decisions, is really the Thomas Court. And we'll talk to Brock about the decades-long strategy to weaponize our judicial system to serve the extreme right wing and what, if anything, can be done about it. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our irrepressible corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, our yearly reminder that Medicare Advantage is a scam. David?
Dr. Adam Gaffney is a physician, writer, public health researcher, and advocate. Dr. Gaffney practices at the Cambridge Health Alliance and is an assistant professor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. A member of the Cambridge Health Justice Lab, his research focuses on healthcare financing, reform and equity, and disparities in lung health. He writes about the policy, politics, and history of healthcare and is the author of To Heal Humankind, The Right to Health in History. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Adam Gaffney.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, welcome indeed, Adam. Let's plunge right in. For listeners who want more detail on the dark side of Medicare disadvantage, as I call it, well, I'm watching this cable TV. It's hard to spend a few minutes without seeing an ad by Humana, by United Healthcare, pushing in the enrollment period that ends on December 5th, new Medicare beneficiaries away from traditional Medicare into Medicare Disadvantage, which is another way of saying they're pushing people out of the government Medicare program into the corporate health insurance program. And if you look at the ads, and there were over 650,000 of them during an enrollment period in 2022 on TV. Imagine. If you look at the ads, you say, this is almost too good to be true. We don't have to have a copay. We can have gym memberships. We can get transportation. We can have vision examinations, ear examinations. But as Dr. Fred Hyde, who knows a little bit about this, once told me about Medicare Disadvantage, is it isn't what you pay, it's what you get. So steer us into the details here, because over 53% of Medicare beneficiaries have been lured, induced deceptively into Medicare Disadvantage, and there's no rebuttal to these ads on TV. They go unquestioned.
Well, this is a big story. There's two sides of it here. Number one, the taxpayers are being massively ripped off by these large corporations in order to generate profits. They overcharge Medicare. They overcharge the public. What would be paid relative to the cost of healthcare under traditional Medicare? So on the one hand, we have a sort of corporate ripoff. And on the other hand, seniors are getting short shrift in terms of the care they're receiving. So what they don't tell you in those television advertisements, what they don't say is that seniors on average in Medicare Advantage get much less health care. And why is that? Well, the Medicare Advantage firms are financially incentivized to reduce care as much as possible. That is how they make money. And so they create various barriers in the forms of narrow networks of physicians and hospitals. So maybe you can only go to some doctors and not the ones you really need. They create prior authorization requirements that make it harder to get the drugs you need or the treatments you need. They create these tight formularies. And through all of these forms of administrative bureaucracy and barriers, seniors in Medicare Advantage get much less care than those in the traditional program. So it might sound good on TV, but the reality is that these plans are not very good once you get sick. If you're healthy, maybe it's okay. But when you get sick, when you need to go to different hospitals, when you need to see specific doctors, when you need more care, when you need more care at home or elsewhere, these plans fall through because that's their business model. And the amazing thing, what we refer to as the Medicare Advantage paradox, is that even though seniors get less care with these plans, the Medicare Advantage firms actually get overpaid by the public. And someone might say, well, how is that possible? If the seniors are getting less care, how can the plans cost more for the public? And the answer is the Medicare Advantage firms take the difference and pocket it basically for their administrative overhead. So, they take more than 14% of the revenue they get from the taxpayer for their administration and profits. That compares to about 2% in the traditional program. So 7 times more waste. And that's the Medicare Advantage paradox. Higher costs, less care.
I found it over the years, Adam, amazing how both parties in Congress kept enabling more and more power to undermine Medicare, traditional Medicare with Medicare Disadvantage. The relevant department in the executive branch is not doing its job in enforcing the laws here. We're talking about, in 1 year alone, Medicare Advantage plans are overpaid by $83 billion. $83 billion. And over the last 15, 20 years, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars going into the coffers of these giant health insurance companies.
That's right. So, we found, in fact, that over $500 billion in overpayments since 2007, enormous overpayments. They use 2 main strategies. Number one is making their patients look as sick as possible through aggressive coding. So they have various tactics of diagnostically upcoding so that their customers look as sick as possible on paper. But then, in reality, they use other strategies that lead to favorable selection, meaning they avoid the sicker Medicare enrollees, what people refer to as lemon dropping, and they try to find the most healthy ones, which some people refer to as cherry picking. So some of the examples of these strategies are trade secrets, but some of them we know about. So on the one hand, they avoid sick people by just the various strategies I referred to earlier, making it harder to go to certain doctors, making it harder to get certain medications. Those barriers are going to not be very attractive if you're an elderly person with significant medical needs. But they've also used other tactics. Their advertisements, for instance, often show very robust seniors. One that I heard about showed a senior on a trampoline. And this might send a message to sicker or more frail seniors, oh, this plan isn't meant for you. Even something as benign seeming as gym memberships, well, that sounds good. I mean, I think everyone should have access to, athletic facilities, of course. But when you offer gym memberships as a sort of extra benefit in a Medicare Advantage plan, that's of course going to be more attractive to healthier, less chronically ill seniors. And the result of that is going to be favorable selection. You get less sick patients, you get less chronically ill patients, you get less disabled patients, and the data bears that out, that on average, sicker people are more likely to leave Medicare Advantage and go to traditional Medicare and vice versa. And that adverse selection means that on average, Medicare Advantage patients are much less sick. But at the same time, going back to what I said earlier, the insurers do make them look as sick as possible through upcoding. And between those two strategies, upcoding and favorable selection, they did generate, as you said, over 80 billion in overpayments.
Is there any source of information where new enrollees or people who have been induced into Medicare Disadvantage want to go back to the traditional Medicare?
I think that what we really need is a change in the system itself. We can give information on how people can navigate these situations they find themselves in because they're in Medicare Advantage. But keep in mind, part of the problem here is that we need to improve benefits in the traditional program too. The traditional program is far more efficient. The traditional program, the public program, does allow you to see every doctor you want, go to the hospitals you need. It is less expensive on average to the society. But it is true that there are missing benefits that we need to also have policy to rectify. There should be vision coverage. There should be, or no copays, in my opinion, in the traditional program. So information is important to enrollees and beneficiaries, but it's very important to also realize that we need to improve and expand the traditional program so that seniors aren't looking elsewhere for those benefits. They have them. They all have them. And that's really what we should do with Medicare Advantage. We should declare it a failed experiment, use those overpayments and all that extra money that we're sending to corporations right now, use that to expand benefits for all seniors. Even better, I would take us to a Medicare for all system and have universal comprehensive care for everyone. But certainly in the meantime, using these overpayments to expand benefits for all Medicare beneficiaries is what makes the most sense.
What if in the 65 million people on Medicare, what if they want to say it was a mistake, I want to get out of Medicare Disadvantage and go back to traditional Medicare? It used to be easier to do that. Now the insurance giants are making it harder. Explain.
Well, one of the problems here is this, supplementary plans that you can get with traditional Medicare and fill in those gaps that I mentioned, and those are popular. But once you're in Medicare Advantage and you want to switch back to traditional Medicare, the community rating, meaning you pay the same premiums for those plans for everyone, is no longer in effect. You might want to be in a situation where getting a Medigap plan to fill in those gaps is more expensive as you shift over. So again, that speaks to why we need policy change, and it's not enough just to inform the public, because there are these real deficiencies in the existing system.
Let's say you're in Medicare, traditional Medicare, and you got Medigap insurance via AARP that contracts it out to United Health Insurance. It's so hard to get reimbursed. I mean, the hoops and the calls that aren't returned and the bureaucracy to try to get reimbursed.
I don't think the Medigap system as it is now is good at all. And the reality is, Ralph, is we don't need Medigap. We could plug those holes with public coverage. There's no reason to have a role for private insurers to cover the slice of our healthcare when all seniors need the same thing, which is comprehensive universal care, right? There's no need for these private stopgap measures. What we need is a public system of true universal care. The Medicare for All movement gained a lot of support and made a lot of progress, in the last decade, but it sort of has moved back off of the center stage at the time being for a variety of reasons. But I think it's absolutely imperative for us to get back on that bandwagon and start talking about it again. Because the reality is this is also an issue that I think unites Americans. People are in favor. It's a popular reform.
Well, in Canada, they cover everybody for less than half the price per capita that occurs in the U.S., which doesn't cover everybody. There are about 22 million people in this country who have no health insurance and another 60 million who are underinsured. So even in terms of the pricing test, the Canadian system is far more superior. So let me ask you a final question here. The medical profession, they don't like the present system. They've lost their professional independence, number one. They are controlled by corporate medicine and corporate bureaucrats and corporate executives, whether it's for-profit or non-profit hospitals. They're being gobbled up by these giant companies like independent cardiology practices are being gobbled up. They're being driven crazy by the billing system. An average doctor practicing today has to have a full-time aide just to deal with billing and how long they wait to be reimbursed. And more doctors are dropping out of Medicare. And yet the American Medical Association and others, there seems to be no resistance here. They're losing the basic independence of their profession and being turned into assembly line workers.
Well, I think that this is a seminal moment in the history of the American medical profession for the reasons that you're saying. You know, we've talked a lot about health insurance and all the problems with the private health insurance industry. But what's happening today, as you're mentioning, is that corporations are now taking over the delivery of healthcare as well. So it's not only about who's paying for healthcare, you know, which is dominated by the insurers. It's also now about the delivery of care. Private equity firms and other for-profit corporations are taking over hospitals, physician practices, hospices, you name it, their hands are in it. And this needs to stop. And this is another reason why we need transformative Medicare for all reform that, you know, I do think will be achieved by the bills in Congress. The problem is the political activism and will is not here at that moment. And we do need to reignite it. And I think going back to what you said about the medical profession, you know, I do think there's growing interest among physicians in change. Their bosses are increasingly these for-profit companies whose mission is not really medicine. Their mission is money. And what we need to do is to rethink our healthcare system so it serves communities, is owned by communities, and it returns us to really, you know, the underlying reason why we went into this profession, which is to help patients and not to pad the pockets of shareholders.
We've been talking with Adam Gaffney of the Harvard Medical School, who has written a great deal on the subject of Medicare and Medicare disadvantage and how to change the system fundamentally so that profit is taken out of it and the health insurance industry is replaced by a fundamental Medicare for all comprehensive healthcare system, improving on Canada, but learning from it. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
We've been speaking with Dr. Adam Gaffney. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. But don't go away yet. We have a follow-up appointment for you with Dr. Marty Makary. David?
Dr. Marty Makary is a Johns Hopkins professor and member of the National Academy of Medicine. He is the author of 2 New York Times best-selling books, Unaccountable and The Price We Pay. Dr. Makary has written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, and he has published more than 250 scientific research articles. He served in leadership at the WHO and has been a visiting professor at 25 medical schools. His latest book is Blind Spots, When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Marty Makary.
David, Steve, Ralph, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome indeed. What Dr. Makary covers is a whole range of treatments that are considered conventional, accurate, proper, and unquestioned. And he does the questioning. So on page 82, he summarizes the prior 82 pages, which I found very useful. And I'll just quote them. The medical establishment got the primary cause of heart disease wrong for 60 years. It got hormone replacement therapy wrong for 22 years. It got antibiotic appropriateness wrong for 60 years. It got peanut allergy prevention wrong for 15 years. And it got the addictive properties of opiates wrong for 20 years, end quote. The consequences are huge numbers of preventable deaths, enduring diseases, pain, economic cost, anxiety, family turmoil, and you name it. You want to give us a little details on this. You start with the peanut allergy, which really is a very dramatic rendition in your book.
Thanks for having me. And yes, I'm very passionate about this. The power of groupthink is big and it can do tremendous damage. And when I hear people say that the reason to do something is that all of the medical societies or the medical establishment has a consensus with no scientific evidence, that scares me because we don't have a good track record when we kind of rule by opinion. And the peanut allergy example was the perfect example. Peanut allergies were rare and generally mild prior to the 1990s. But because of a few media stories and a slightly increasing prevalence of peanut allergies, the experts, the geniuses at the American Academy of Pediatrics, felt like they needed to tell people what to do to prevent peanut allergies. The problem is they didn't know, so they made something up. They said, well, avoid peanut butter until a kid turns 3 years of age. And what that actually did was it created a sensitivity in the immune system, and it increased peanut allergies later in life, like 8-fold increase. And so the more they ignited this peanut allergy epidemic, the more schools and homes went to peanut abstinence, which meant other kids were not exposed to peanut butter and peanuts early in life, which created more immune intolerance. And it just became this self-licking ice cream cone. I mean, a perpetual vicious cycle that has given us the worst peanut allergy epidemic in the world. It's not genetic. This is by and large a manufactured epidemic that existed in a mild form prior to 2000. The year 2000 is when they put out the dogma. For most of the last quarter century, the medical establishment insisted on increased compliance with their recommendation, and they were fueling the fire. And Africa has no peanut allergies. They're ultra rare in most of Europe and Asia, but this is the consequence of medical hubris.
Let's go to perhaps the most controversial part of the book. Year after year, people are told, beware of your cholesterol levels. Don't eat too much fatty foods, saturated fats. And if you do that, you'll have fewer heart attacks. You challenge that from A to Z. Please explain.
Well, one guy with no evidence really went on a bandwagon starting in the 1960s, claiming that the reason we were having all these health problems, heart disease and so many other problems, was because people were eating natural fat, saturated fat. And so he was a politician, physiologist, and this guy, Dr. Ansel Keys, convinced the world. He convinced the medical establishment and the American Heart Association. They started making millions off of licensing out their low-fat, healthy heart seal to restaurants and selling low-fat and low-cholesterol cookbooks. The great irony is that the cholesterol that you eat is not even absorbed in your body. It goes right through your system. 90+% of it goes right through your system. It's esterified, which means it's bound to a bulky side chain, so it's just not absorbed. 99% of your body's cholesterol is made by your body, made by the liver. So the great irony is we created a dogma that's resulted in, to this day, people tiptoeing around cholesterol in food products, people avoiding natural saturated fats. And we put out the wrong tests to measure somebody's risk of heart disease. At least they're very crude tests, LDL and HDL. Really, people are not hearing about the right tests, that is ApoB, apolipoprotein B, and lipoprotein A. Those are much more sensitive predictors of early heart disease. And when we were on the pile-on trashing natural saturated fats, we ignored the roles of refined carbohydrates, ultra-processed foods, pesticides, and so many other chemicals that are engineered chemically to be added to food to make it more addictive or taste a certain way, or even to look pretty with certain colors. Over 1,000 of these chemicals are banned in Europe or Canada, and they are mainstay and staple in American food.
You make clear you're talking about natural saturated fats, not trans fats in processed foods, correct?
That's right. And there's a small subgroup of the population where a high proportion of saturated fats can be bad for one's health, but we're talking about a small subset that can be tracked by measuring an ApoB. And for the vast majority of people, the keto diet or a natural balance, a normal balance of saturated fat in the diet is not only not bad for you, it's actually healthy.
Let's talk about antibiotic appropriateness. It's been well known that antibiotic resistance takes over 100,000 lives in the United States a year, but you go deeper than that. It's not only the reckless prescription of antibiotics when people have viruses by doctors and drug companies promoting it, but you go deeper than that. What do you mean when you say the medical establishment got antibiotic appropriateness wrong for 60 years? What a deadly toll, by the way.
Well, most antibiotics are unnecessary. Study after study has shown that antibiotics can save lives, they can do tremendous good, but it's helpful to have some context. For most of human history, doctors were respected, but maybe like you would respect your hairdresser or maybe a clergy member in the community. And we didn't have many tools as doctors. We had a lancet, we had a saw to do amputations, we had a couple drugs that didn't work or were counterproductive, like digoxin. And then what happened in 1922 is Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. And by the post-World War II era, in the 1940s and 50s, we saw the mass production of antibiotics. That ushered in the white coat era of medicine. Doctors began to wear a white coat. They now had the power to prescribe a magical pill that could cure disease, make childbirth safe, enable surgeons to do procedures safer. And this ushered in this new unquestioned authority. And what happened was physicians as a class took advantage of this unquestioned authority. They would separate babies at birth, for example, for 50 years. A baby that was born normal, healthy, at term would be separated from the mom for a couple days to 10 days was the routine through the 1950s, just because we had this unquestioned authority. And the irony is, in the 1940s, the guy who discovered penicillin and revolutionized medicine, defining the white coat era of medicine, he warned after he got the Nobel Prize with a stern warning about the overuse of antibiotics, having unintended consequences, having side effects. And guess what we're learning now? The antibiotics kill bacteria, so they are carpet bombing the normal microbiome, that is the lining of the GI tract with millions of different bacteria that are critical in absorption and digestion, training the immune system. They produce serotonin involved in mood and mental health. As a matter of fact, most serotonin comes from the microbiome in the gut. So we've ignored gut health in our modern medical culture. It's one of the giant blind spots. And part of that has been a dogma that, these antibiotics probably won't help you, but they won't hurt you. No, they are carpet bombing the microbiome, altering the gut lining and the gut health of a generation.
On the other hand, you show in your book that antibiotics has been shown to be useful in many cases, replacing appendicitis surgeries and dealing with ulcers.
So if there's ever a good indication to give an antibiotic, is to avoid a big operation. And so a short course of antibiotics for straightforward appendicitis actually can avoid the need for surgery 2/3 of the time. And by the way, most people are getting the antibiotics by the time they get to surgery anyway. We've noticed for a while that people who come to surgery sometimes are almost cured if we get to doing the surgery in a delayed time period. And now new research has shown, hey, if there's one good indication for antibiotics, because there are important clinical indications for antibiotics, it might be to avoid an operation. But most antibiotics prescribed are unnecessary. 60% in one big study. I think it's higher. I think it's around 80%.
And people get antibiotics by eating meat, say cattle or pigs that are injected with therapeutic antibiotics. They're not sick. They're just injected with these antibiotics routinely.
Yeah, it makes the animals fatter. And so this is an interesting observation that the world expert on the microbiome had. He asked the question, appropriately, that if antibiotics are altering the gut microbiome of animals and making them fatter, what is it doing to children? And so he did the studies, and sure enough, In one of the largest, most compelling studies I've seen in the last 10 years from the Mayo Clinic, they looked at 14,000 kids by those who had antibiotics in the first couple years of life compared to kids who didn't. Kids who took antibiotics in the first couple years of life had a 20% higher risk of obesity and a 32% higher rate of attention deficit disorder. Remember that connection between gut bacteria and the brain. And a 90% higher rate of asthma and nearly a 300% higher rate of celiac. So we have altered the microbiomes of a generation in the same way that farmers have observed for years that when you give antibiotics to animals, it makes them more obese.
Let's talk about groupthink here. As you say in your book, the errors are not oversights of an ancient era. They are avoidable mistakes in modern medicine. And nothing is more prominent in your book than the opioid epidemic, which has taken over 1 million American lives just in the last 10 years. And you say that the medical establishment got the addictive properties of opioids wrong for 20 years. Was it the medical establishment, or was it Purdue Pharmaceutical, the big corporations, the Sackler family that launched it all?
There's been really one media narrative about the opioid epidemic, and it was 100% the fault of Purdue Pharma. But actually, in the book, I explore that many people had a piece of the pie. It was the medical establishment, the medical associations that took money from Purdue Pharma and other corporations and sidelined, silenced, censored, and railroaded the scientists who said, hey, no, opioids are addictive. We've seen it in our clinical practice. And so we have a way in our modern culture of vilifying one individual party, and then the pile on just begins. But the reality is the medical community was complicit. The studies were done, but they were ignored. The people who spoke up against the narrative were silenced. And I think that is the danger of groupthink. A herd mentality can turn into a mob mentality. And then it becomes that same argument we discussed in the opening of this conversation. Well, how dare you challenge the medical establishment? There's a consensus of the medical associations on this topic, but an illusion of consensus is not scientific study. And we have to have a civil discourse in medicine. And if we don't have a civil discourse, we don't have science, because the purpose of science is to challenge deeply held assumptions. Why did the FDA approve OxyContin based on a 14-day follow-up study? They have blood on their hands too. So we have a media narrative that's just been one narrative everywhere, and that is it's 100% the fault of a greedy pharmaceutical company leadership. It's actually far more complex.
You mentioned that before you get to insulin and diabetes, you should talk about the food people are eating or shouldn't be eating, right?
That's right. Maybe we need to treat more diabetes with cooking classes than just throwing insulin at everybody. Maybe we need to talk about school lunch programs and not just putting every overweight kid on Ozempic, as the American Academy of Pediatrics is pushing forward today. Maybe we need to talk about environmental exposures that cause cancer, not just the chemo to treat it. And we've got to talk about food as medicine and general body inflammation. I had no education on these topics in medical school. Basically, none. We were told what inflammation was, but nobody made the connection between the causes of inflammation in what we eat and what we do, and inflammation as a root cause of cancer and chronic diseases. So how can you look at this surge that we're watching right now of colon cancer in young people and only talk about chemotherapy and surgery? And unfortunately, in the medical field, the term prevention has been hijacked by the mindset of more medical testing. There's an increase in breast cancer in younger people. Instead of talking about the estrogen-like binding properties of different chemicals like pesticides, and instead of talking about the estrogen properties of atrazine, which is a well-known weed killer that can make a female frog turn male. I mean, that's how the hormonal disruption properties of some of these chemicals are unbelievable. No one's talking about that. Instead, we just talk about, oh, well, we need to do more mammograms and move the age of mammograms down. Well, the best way to lower healthcare costs are to stop taking these drugs we don't need and to address the root causes.
We've been speaking with Dr. Marty Makary, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine physician, greatly published in the medical literature, an advocate for evidence-based medicine, no matter where the chips may fall, offending groupthink, medical establishment myopia, or profiteering, regardless of its adverse impact on innocent patients. Thank you very much, Dr. Makary.
Great to be with you all. Thanks so much.
We've been speaking with Dr. Marty Makary. We will link to his book, Blind Spots, at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we'll shift gears from medicine to politics when we speak to David Brock, author of Stench, The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, October 25, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Dozens of people rallied outside the Michigan headquarters of Kellogg Company last week, demanding that the company remove artificial dyes from its breakfast cereals in the United States. That's going to report in USA Today. Kellogg, the maker of Fruit Loops and Apple Jacks, announced nearly a decade ago it would remove artificial colors and ingredients from its products by 2018. The company has done that in other countries. In Canada, for example, Fruit Loops are colored with concentrated carrot juice, watermelon juice, and blueberry juice. But in the United States, the cereal still contains artificial colors and BHT, a chemical preservative. Activists said they were delivering petitions with more than 400,000 signatures asking Kellogg to remove artificial dyes and BHT from their cereals in the United States. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Next up, we speak to the author of a blistering expose of Clarence Thomas and the conservative regime of corruption that has usurped the Supreme Court. David?
David Brock is a Democratic activist and founder of Media Matters for America, a progressive media watchdog group. Following the 2010 elections, Mr. Brock founded the super PAC American Bridge, which works to elect Democrats, is a New York Times bestselling author, and his books include the memoir, Blinded by the Right, The Conscience of an Ex-Conservative, Killing the Messenger, The Right-Wing Plot to Hijack Your Government, and his latest book is Stench, The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, David Brock.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Welcome, David. You also have started a new group called Facts First USA. Very much needed in this disinformation age, as the euphemism goes, in our country and world and on our internet. Listeners, you're going to be treated to someone who's actually changed his mind. You know how hard it is for people to change their minds? Well, he used to be a big supporter of Republicans. He now describes himself on page 276 of his book. He says, I describe myself as a former right-winger turned Democrat. Former right-winger turned Democrat. And this book, Stench, The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America, illustrates his long-standing connection with who gets appointed to the bench, to the judiciary in this country with Senate confirmation hearings. And he's turned around on his former support of Clarence Thomas and now sees Clarence Thomas and his influence on the court associated with recent nominees that were confirmed under the Trump administration as a major, major menace to American democracy. Explain the Thomas peril here.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, so I basically traced the rot in the current Supreme Court back to the original sin of the Thomas confirmation hearing, when Thomas was allowed to commit perjury to get himself on the court. At the time, I was a Thomas supporter. I wrote very supportive of him and against Anita Hill. But what happened to me was I got drawn into their inner circle. And once I was in the inner circle, they started over time to admit to me that they didn't believe Thomas, that Thomas had done the things she said. And this was all just a political game. So I was sold a bill of goods. I obviously take responsibility for what I did, but basically I was used, and that's what happened. And so I trace in the book, I go back to that period and recount what happened to me. And then I used that as a jumping off point to show what happened to the court, the 30, 40-year right-wing campaign to capture the court, which I had a front row seat on during the Thomas confirmation. And then obviously after some period of time, changed my political affiliations to Democrat, started Media Matters in 2004, which is a media watchdog group. But that was my trajectory. And I think that the reason I say this was the making of the Thomas court and the unmaking of America is that John Roberts lost control of the court during the deliberations over the Dobbs decision. He did not want to overturn Roe and tried to get other justices to side with him. He seemed to be perhaps making some progress, but the Thomas view prevailed. There was a leak to the Wall Street Journal editorial page that locked in the wavering justices into the side of turning over Roe v. Wade. And Roberts was the sixth vote, but not really, because he wanted to uphold the Mississippi law and keep at least partial Roe v. Wade.
Well, I was up during the confirmation hearings in the Senate when you were there as well, David, and the nominee, Clarence Thomas, was called by George Herbert Walker Bush the most qualified nominee for the Supreme Court justice in the United States at that time. Well, he took the place of the great Thurgood Marshall, the great civil rights lawyer who won the basic civil rights litigation, the Brown versus Board of Education case, and he became a Supreme Court Associate Justice. And it's quite ironic that someone with such extreme right-wing views like Clarence Thomas would replace someone like Thurgood Marshall. But I would go into one Senate office after another. Listeners, you may not know that Clarence Thomas was confirmed 52 to 48 in the Democratic Senate, a significant Democratic majority. And the majority leader, Senator George Mitchell, was sitting in his office, essentially not twisting any arms. And so 11 Democrats crossed the aisle and made Clarence Thomas' nomination successful by a 52 to 48 vote. I remember going into Joe Lieberman's office and telling him about the background of Clarence Thomas, and he changed his vote and opposed Clarence Thomas, as he told me later. So it's really puzzling, David Brock, to see how he unfurled himself onto the court and into further nominations of the Supreme Court by Republican presidents. And a lot of it was his connections and support by the powerful Federalist Society. Tell us about the powerful Federalist Society and its remaking of the court.
Yes, so the Federalist Society was originally founded by three right-wing law students, and it was pitched as a debating society. So I don't think, in the original incarnation, they had a master plan, but soon enough, they realized that membership in the Federalist Society could confer on people a certain imprimatur for appointments. And that's appointments not only to the federal judiciary, but all through the executive branch, particularly in the George W. Bush administration. And so this was a way of signaling to their own folks that they were on their side. But it was a way of hiding from the Senate Judiciary Committee and the confirmation process what was really going on. And so if you look at the very first session of the Federalist Society, Robert Bork, who was then just a sitting federal judge, just confirmed, gave a speech in which he talked about abortion being the central issue of the day and assailed Roe v. Wade. And so this was the scheme to overturn Roe has been going on for all these decades. There were setbacks, of course, because there were times when Republican appointees ended up being independent. Sandra Day O'Connor, for example, David Souter, for example, and the right was defeated in their effort to overturn Roe. So it took a while, and it took a lot of steadfast, patient spending of money on their crusade. The Federal Society, a couple other things to know about it, is run by Leonard Leo, a right-wing operative who is affiliated with a very extremist movement in the Catholic Church called Opus Dei. So for Leonard Leo, this is partly a religious crusade. And what he was very successful in doing was taking the social conservatives, the evangelical vote that Ronald Reagan started courting, and fusing that with the big business interests, the Koch brothers and other captains of industry funded the Federalist Society work over these years. And of course, what they were getting back were decisions beyond just Roe, were decisions that affected everything from environmental protection, consumer rights, gun control, affirmative action. So they were getting a big benefit. In the book, from my research, I show that in the last 10 years, the Federalist Society spent $750 million on their campaigns to confirm these judges. And they got a lot more in return for that. They got billions of dollars to big business for favorable decisions from the 5 or 6, depending on how you count it. The supermajority is 6, and Roberts is on the wrong end of a lot of these decisions. All 5 of the Roe majority were members of the Federalist Society and also right-wing Catholics. And so that's basically in a nutshell, the story. The Federalist Society, of course, expanded its tentacles after Citizens United, which brought all the dark money into our system. And they went from budgets of, say, 20 million a year to in the hundreds of millions that went into Leo's system, some of it into his own pocket. That's been controversial, where he's got private consulting firms that the Federalist Society and his other groups pay. They hire firms that he runs. Well, he's an officer of these organizations and has enriched himself quite well, in addition to spending all this money on getting these folks confirmed. And as I said, the people who are funding it are getting a great return on the dollar.
For sure. From our perspective, David, the progressive perspective, the question arises, what about the opposition to the Federalist Society? Why did the liberals allow Clarence Thomas to clear the Senate Judiciary Committee, chaired by Joe Biden, and sail to a 52-48 victory when they knew how right-wing and extreme his views were? It wasn't something Clarence Thomas covered up during the hearing. And then after that, when Thomas began having allies on the Supreme Court because of Republican nominations, the Federalist Society didn't seem to have much opposition. Isn't there a Madison Society that was set up to try to counteract the Federalist Society? How do you explain two things: the collapse of the Democratic Party here and the weakness on the liberal progressive side, from which you can provide an interesting perspective, having been on the Clarence Thomas side and saw a lot from the inside, which you talk about in great gripping detail in your book, Stench, The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America.
Yes, well, a couple things about the Thomas case. One is they had a version of the old Nixon Southern strategy when they picked Clarence Thomas. So you have to realize that the Thomas nomination was made after Bork went down in flames. And so they needed a different strategy. They couldn't get exactly Bork through, but a black Bork they thought they could get through by pressure on certain senators, which worked, particularly senators in states where there were larger African-American constituencies. And so part of it was the prevailing of the Southern strategy. Part of it was, you mentioned, unfortunately, Joe Biden was the chairman of this committee, and he made a deal with the Republicans to only have Anita Hill here and to prevent other witnesses from testifying. And that was a big mistake that he's later said he regrets. But he was, I think, out of deference to the process, to his views of institutionalism, he was playing more judge than senator. So there were witnesses in the wings that could have corroborated Anita Hill's testimony. It all came out later, but it was later. It came out that, in fact, he had 3 other victims of sexual harassment that were not able to testify. There have been over the years various liberal efforts to counter the work of the Federalist Society, the main one being the American Constitution Society. But it's a very different animal. It really is a debating society, which is what the Federalist Society pretend to be. So there isn't the single-mindedness of a mission on the Democratic side. Now, the same thing happened with Brett Kavanaugh, where he had an accuser, credible accuser, but deals were made with the Republicans again that there would be no witnesses other than Christine Blasey Ford. And it all came out in the wash later that, in fact, there were other witnesses that were willing to testify that were prevented from testifying. Dianne Feinstein sat on this allegation for weeks, never told her, even her Democratic colleagues, that it existed, and lost critical time there. I think with an outcome that might have been different. She says she did that to protect the accuser, but it had the effect of this coming out so late that you couldn't really gather the evidence. And then the FBI did a sham investigation over just the course of a couple days. It's amazing. They had 4,500 tips into an FBI tip line, and they all went to the White House counsel's office, where they went in a circular file, and none of it was investigated. So the Democrats do have some culpability here for all that. They've never paid attention to the courts. They don't vote on the courts. Hillary Clinton gave a speech in 2016 about the danger of the openings, 2 or 3, she said, that would be coming in the first term of the next president. And that was ignored. It wasn't reported by the press. And Democrats didn't take it seriously enough. They never took the prospect of Roe versus Wade being overturned as a serious thing either. So this has been endemic for a number of years.
Well, it continues with the Senate Judiciary Committee under Democratic control now, and Senator Durbin and Senator Whitehouse looking into the Clarence Thomas corruption, the paid junkets that rich people have flown them to various resorts and watering holes of the rich around the country and the world, providing them with huge, lavish gifts, many of which he did not disclose as he's required to under federal law, and his relations with his wife, Ginny, who is a overt right-winger, election denier, Trump supporter, and makes a lot of money in the process. And yet Clarence Thomas has not recused himself in cases where there's a clear conflict of interest. Back to the Senate Judiciary Committee, they're looking into it. They had hearings, but they won't subpoena Thomas. They've asked Thomas to testify voluntarily. He denied, and they won't issue a subpoena of Clarence Thomas or John Roberts. What's your view on this rather recessive posture by 2 senators who know better and who have all kinds of alarms, especially White House, about the tremendously destructive impact on American democracy that the Roberts-Thomas court is spearheading?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that White House has done an awful lot as a senator to educate the public about the impact of the Federalist Society and how the courts were captured by the right wing, and has written a couple of books himself about the subject, and is a strong advocate for what you're saying, but he's not the chairman of the committee. And Durbin has been a weak actor here. And as you say, there are things that could have been done. Thomas and Ginny Thomas, I think, should have been subpoenaed. She was allowed to just give an interview to the January 6th Commission, wasn't even under oath. So we don't know the full story of her involvement in January 6th, but we do know that Thomas should recuse himself in these January 6th cases, and the gifts are just egregious. And so the last thing that's happened is Senator Durbin and Senator Wyden in July sent a criminal referral of Clarence Thomas to the Justice Department. And that's based on what you said, which is there's a lot of talk, which is good, having an ethics regime that applies to the Supreme Court, because right now the ethics is self-enforcing for the court, and the lower courts all have rules. So that's a conversation worth having, but there are laws on the books right now that Thomas is violating that people don't talk about. So the gifts are definitely a violation of the Ethics in Government Act from 1978. And there are federal laws requiring recusal that he's also violated. So now it's in the hands of Merrick Garland. And here you're going to get another Democratic appointee who's not going to do anything, I imagine, to bring the Thomas to some measure of accountability.
We've been talking with David Brock, author of the brand new book, Stench, The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America, published by one of the better publishers, Alfred Knopf, and is being widely reviewed. As I see your book, David, this is the history of how the Supreme Court was constituted in order to produce an ongoing judicial coup d'etat, rewriting the Constitution, rebuking the founders' emphasis on congressional power, entrenching the corporate state over workers and consumers, and turning our president, with its latest decision last June, into an unaccountable monarch, able to commit criminal acts without any kind of prosecution. This has never been the case in American history. There have been conservative courts, liberal courts, but not one that by a majority of 6-3 is entrenching an ongoing judicial coup d'etat against the American people. Thank you for writing this book, and listeners should get a copy for their local libraries, for their book clubs, and try to get it discussed as a sine qua non of civic alertness in our dwindling democratic society before it's really too late. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
We've been speaking with David Brock. We will link to his book, Stench, at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Dr. Adam Gaffney, Dr. Marty Makary, and David Brock. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Get active. Get out to vote. Vote your conscience. That's the only way.
Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too high. Wow. Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person. And who will hear your voice?